1503-1510, expansion of labor demands in Hispaniola. By the early 1500s, the Spanish colony of Hispaniola was rapidly expanding. What had once been exploratory voyages into unfamiliar territory were now evolving into permanent colonial settlements tied to empire, mining, agriculture, and Atlantic trade. But, expansion created new problems. Spanish officials demanded larger labor forces to support growing colonial ambitions. Gold mining operations expanded deeper into the colony, construction projects increased, and agricultural systems began developing throughout the Caribbean. At the same time, indigenous populations were declining at devastating rates due to disease, warfare, displacement, and forced labor systems imposed by colonial authorities. Despite earlier concerns about resistance and instability, colonial leaders increasingly turned toward African labor systems already connected to Atlantic trade networks. Between 1503 and 1510, labor demands in Hispaniola intensified dramatically, helping transform African slavery from a limited colonial practice into a growing institutional system. This period marked one of the earliest expansions of organized Negro slavery in the Americas. In earlier years, Governor Nicolas de Ovando had expressed concern about importing enslaved Africans into Hispaniola. Historical accounts indicate that some Africans escaped Spanish control, fled into mountainous regions, and participated in acts of resistance against colonial settlements. Ovando feared larger uprisings and instability within the colony. For a brief period, Spanish authorities restricted additional imports, but economic pressures soon overpowered those concerns. As mining operations expanded and colonial infrastructure grew, labor shortages became increasingly severe. Spanish officials believed indigenous populations alone could no longer sustain the demands of colonial expansion. As a result, Ovando reversed course. He began requesting additional African laborers for mines and colonial projects throughout Hispaniola. This shift revealed an important historical reality. Economic expansion was becoming more important to colonial authorities than earlier fears about resistance. During the early 1500s, gold mining became one of the central economic goals of Spanish colonial expansion in the Caribbean. Spanish settlers searched rivers, mountains, and mining zones throughout Hispaniola for valuable resources that could strengthen Spain's growing empire. Mining labor was physically demanding and dangerous. Colonial authorities increasingly forced both indigenous people and enslaved Africans into exhausting labor conditions connected to mining operations. By the middle of the decade, Spanish officials viewed African laborers as increasingly important to sustaining colonial production. Historical records indicate that King Ferdinand approved the transportation of additional enslaved Africans into the colony. Around 100 enslaved Africans were reportedly sent from Spain during this period. By 1510, colonial officials requested hundreds more. The labor system was expanding rapidly. What makes this period historically important is that slavery was no longer developing as a temporary colonial experiment. It was becoming institutionalized. Spanish authorities were now creating labor policies, transport systems, trade networks, and economic structures designed to support long-term colonial expansion. African slavery was increasingly tied directly to mining, construction, agriculture, and imperial wealth. The colony of Hispaniola became one of the earliest testing grounds for these developing systems. And as colonial profits increased, the demand for labor continued growing. This expansion would soon spread throughout other Caribbean territories and eventually across mainland regions of the Americas. Even as the labor system expanded, resistance never disappeared. Escapes, acts of defiance, and alliances between Africans and indigenous populations continued creating concern among colonial authorities. The growth of slavery also increased colonial militarization throughout parts of Hispaniola. Spanish officials understood that forced labor systems required violence, surveillance, and control to maintain stability. This pattern would continue throughout the history of Atlantic slavery. The growth of the system also produced the growth of resistance against it. By 1510, the foundations of a much larger Atlantic system were beginning to emerge. What started in Hispaniola would soon expand into Cuba, Jamaica, Mexico, Brazil, South America, and eventually English North America. African labor was becoming increasingly central to colonial expansion across the Atlantic world. And the systems developing during this period would reshape global history for centuries. As labor demands continued growing, Spanish colonial expansion spread deeper into the Caribbean. New colonies in Cuba and Jamaica began importing enslaved Africans to support expanding colonial systems. At the same time, Atlantic trade networks continued evolving into larger commercial operations connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The next part of this documentary series will examine the spread of African slave shipments into Cuba and Jamaica, the expansion of Caribbean labor systems, and the growing role of Atlantic trade networks during the early 1500s. Watch all parts of the Negro Timeline series video on YouTube. Citations and sources will be posted on the Black Tube. Follow at Who Did You Boycott Today? Visit the Negro Ancestors History website for more documented Negro history, content, resources, and cash giveaways. If you found this documentary helpful, please consider subscribing. Likes, shares, and comments help independent creators reach YouTube monetization and continue producing educational content like this. Thank you for watching.